can start. All right. So we've had a fantastic day of a variety of conversations over the last 2 days about narrative building, the really co-powering and transforming simultaneously. As we think about that change, and we've been talking about icons within this industry of ours, from a superhero's journey in the ways of working, from Afrofuturism and sparking the imagination, we are now at what has been a phenomenon in the last 3 years. Has it been 3 years? Yeah, 5 years, actually. Thanks for the clarification. Of what we would say has been a phenomenon within our transition, how we relate to science fiction and Afrofuturism, which probably the people watching it doesn't even know, and how we can co-power this together. So as we think about this conversation, narrative building, and moving it forward, I would like to start off with the conversations we had today. So I have Dr. Clark, I have Dr. Greason, I have Marika Pfefferkorn, and myself. And so, Dr. Clark, as we start this journey on the imagination, and just a moment, just to kind of speak to your thoughts in this space and the impact that you've seen with Afrofuturism, and any thoughts you may have as we enter this journey.
Thank you for the question. Can you hear me? Everybody hear me? So please, please, please call me Tanya. So, with this being grounded in Black Panther, of course, Black Panther's release in 2018 was a social phenomenon, right? A cultural phenomenon. But, we've been working with Afrofuturist themes and concepts before the movie, but I do realize that for the larger movie viewing audience, that this might have been their first time and their first kind of foray into seeing an uncolonized African country, what African countries would have looked like if they had been untouched, right, by colonization and imperialism. And they got to see themselves represented on the big screen, and they got to get an answer to that question that I think a lot of Black people have asked themselves in terms of, what would I look like? What would I sound like? What would my legacy and my ancestry be? Had the continent been untouched? And so I think that that's one of the things that makes Black Panther such a useful film, right? That it brought us together in communities. That first Halloween after it came out, I was Shuri, and the twins were Killmonger and the Black Panther. So I get it. And so when we think about how we look in the future, I think a lot of us would like for it to look in some way, shape, or form like that. I also see, in some ways, the community that I'm in the Atlanta University Center, as a kind of Wakanda, if you will, where there's this center of Black intellectual thought, where I take my young sons so that they can see this other narrative of what Blackness is, particularly what Black maleness is. And so, so Afrofuturism kind of gives us that window for us to, as we are rooted, in our present, but still kind of reach back and think about the historical importance of our culture, and then using those things to help us kind of think about the future. So, right, that's the conversation around Afrofuturism that we've been having these past 2 days. But, also as someone who does literature, right, then I can also see in the way in which Black Panther affirmed us, right, through representation and the idea of a what if Africa was uncolonized. In some of the literature, right, and I'm thinking particularly of the literature of Octavia Butler, which I mentioned earlier, right, she is dealing with a dystopic American society, one that has come, at our own hand. But then still giving us a lens through the future, to look at the future, even though it might be, I think, on a more, where's Rob? A more pessimistic there he is, kind of perspective, but we still get there, right? And so I think it's important to have a full picture of the possibilities of what narratives can do for us.
I really appreciate that, Tanya. Dr. Greason, would you like to expound on your profound work in the space and as a shaper of it? Anything you want as you level set and set the theme for us?
Thank you, and certainly please call me Walter. It's a profound moment for me to have this here at Macalester. This is still a new space for me. I've only been faculty here for 2 years, but the chance to do this work with a center dedicated to global citizenship in the name of Kofi Annan, like it's very much part of what has changed in the last 70 or 80 years to make African leadership possible around the world in ways that it was not during the era of World War II and before. And so it's an important note to mark, especially that we have the Muhammad El-Kati lecture this evening, where my predecessor in the history department faced enormous barriers about advancing Black studies and about discussing the African diaspora on this campus for the better part of 30 years. And so bringing this legacy forward and having this conversation with the Twin Cities Innovation Alliance and particularly thinking about data for public good, that core relationship. It's not data for capitalist extraction. There would be a lot of money in doing such an event, and lots of people do this. But this one is very different about the way we construct a global society that is more just, more equitable, more open. And that's very much what has been the heart of my work related to the Black Panther specifically, but the idea of Wakanda much more generally. And so to open this particular panel, I have to kind of disclose that I am not a normal historian. I have chips embedded in the back of my neck. No.
I knew it. I knew it.
No, but I did spend over a decade learning computer science before I ever started to get trained as a historian. And so the basic way that my mind works is in terms of lines of code and how do we actually design systems that then reach different kinds of goals. And so it's funny, if a couple of my students have been in and out throughout the day, if they take my classes, they learn how to do different kinds of analysis that are very specifically coded about how they break out and ask new questions and find multiple kinds of solutions to different problems. And we do that every time we meet over and over and over again. So by the time the semester's over, they've incorporated in themselves a way of looking at the world differently and finding better answers than are just available in what's in our databases or in our published bibliographies. So in that sense, I've been doing and building Wakanda for a really long time. And it was in the path of actually shaping the Wakanda that showed up in the films that I started to realize why I came to that place, is that people would say over and over again immediately after the films became popular, well, Wakanda's not real. Wakanda doesn't exist. And go through these stories, ignoring the prima facie evidence that you have a university community like this, or we have an extraordinary set of communities around the DC area. And for me particularly, there was the phenomena of communities called Black brain belts. And these are communities of Black scientists between 1920 and 1990 that basically invented the world we inhabit now. And so the one that I grew up in was in New Jersey, and it was centered around a military base that ran all the communications for the NATO alliance between 1940 and 1994. And how did they do this? It wasn't just, they did run wires across the Atlantic Ocean to enable hardwire communications. But the particular scientist that I uncovered and have emphasized is a man named Walter McAfee, who basically calculated the speed of the moon relative to the Earth in 1947. And then doing so, enabled his colleagues to bounce a radio signal off of the moon and then receive the radio content back on Earth and measure the time that it took to do that. And in doing that, laid the foundation for all satellite communications that we all enjoy today, that we understand how fast these objects around the Earth in orbit move so that we can have reliable systems of global communication. Most notably, Dr. McAfee's work was classified until 2004 because his project, Project Diana, named for the Greek goddess of the moon, Project Diana was then used for military missile guidance systems. So the way that we see that we actually light up what targets the military is using to try and hit is all based on Walter McAfee's math. And so we see the story of something like Hidden Figures, but we barely scratch the surface when we look at one film about this. We have thousands upon thousands of these stories of black scientists who basically invented the modern world that we know today. And they were from the real life basis of what we imagine Wakanda to have been. And so I look back at that opening scene when, it's not Njajaka, it's his father, Njoku, is telling his son the story of where they came from. And the meteor strikes the center of Africa, and you see the history of the world unfold differently around the country. And in that moment, we're seeing the reinvention of what's possible and how do we see an alternative. But to me, McAllister is that place where we can actually reimagine what's possible moving forward from now. That we don't have to, in this place, imagine that we only have to replicate the displacement and destruction of indigenous communities. We don't have to, in this place, imagine that there's only the extraction and ownership and abuse of people of the African diaspora. We have an opportunity on this campus to actually build not just a Wakanda around African identity and African history, but a Wakanda that actually brings us all together for a more prosperous, inclusive, healthy future. And so that's the core of the work that I do here, and I fight every day with my colleagues trying to talk about the skills that we need to give through our classes in terms of augmented reality, virtual reality, the way we do data visualization, that we're very good as a college with traditional academic skills, you know, literary analysis, historical analysis, mathematical applications. But our faculty need to have more productive conversations around future skills. And that's what I'm doing. That's my struggle almost every day on campus, is how do we forecast what we do to be prepared for the next decade, the next 20 years? That the world we have in 2040 is not shaped yet, but our work and the way we explore together can make it the best possible that we can imagine. So thank you.
I appreciate that, Walter. And that's profound, thinking about the future and how you co-power the emerging horizon. Is really important to figure out what to anchor into the present and just speaking to the vast work. So really appreciate that. Thanks for the introduction. Marika, you're up. So in your thoughts, what would you like to share in preparation for this conversation we're going to have in your work and the spaces that we have? What would you lean into before we begin with our direct questions?
I think about in December when Wakanda Forever came out, we had the Youth Initiatives for Justice program, and we did a family screening, and we invited Walter in to have the conversation. So for me, Wakanda is a beginning point to, again, that point of entry that we need to have across our communities to have these conversations. It ignited their imagination. They hadn't heard of the language of world building. They hadn't thought of, somebody had to create this. This wasn't just a bunch of producers behind the scene, that there was a deep level of work that had to exist in order to do this world building. And so we had the opportunity to, after that session, we did an imagination of world building where they did collaging to really think about what did they take away? What would they like to carry forward from that vision of Wakanda? What was it missing? What would they like to see? And for me, this conversation is about unlocking both the past, because we had to really take time to reflect on historically, how was this informed? We had to talk about the present. Where are the opportunities for world building right now? And how can you show up in those spaces, especially as young people that are often told that you're the future, you're not the right now? And then how do you carry that conversation forward with your families and your communities and those communities that you want to see? And the takeaway was it actually reflects on that conversation you had in the last panel where there was the gatekeeping of who holds the imagination for our future. Because a lot of our children in the program were either African immigrants or African American students here who had parents that had a very precise vision and journey for the young people to take. And the imagination was not a part of that conversation. And so how do you come back to your family and say, you know, I really want to think about the world that we're building differently, and I want to engage in activities that don't look like traditional academic activities. And the young people are on their path, they're in high school, they're thinking about what is our next step. And so I reflected back about, you know, where did I come into the point of entry about world building, and where were those possibilities for me when I was growing up? And so for me, like you said, Wakanda Forever is not a new thought. Octavia Butler in 1970 was trying to, in an isolated community, try to figure out what that would look like. But that this is really an invitation for us to think about an emergent horizon. What is right in front of us, but we can't touch or see exactly right now. And that was a moment that opened doors, not just for those young people, but for their families and for their communities. And so the conversation didn't just end after the movie closed down, but stories were written, art was made, conversations were held. And so for me, this is just, again, how do we have these points of entry so that we can have the conversation that I didn't know the satellite piece of information, and how do you correlate that to who you are, how you can own that as owning the title of a technologist. Everyone in Wakanda was a technologist because they were existing in a pattern of technology. And so for me, how can we just open that can enough for the air to shift, the opportunities to open, the gates to be deconstructed? And so we'll talk about this more in this conversation, but my lens is from the young people that are walking in this reality right now, trying to dream, but don't have the tools to even ignite that spark unless somebody tells them they can.
Wow, thank you. That was really powerful. I really appreciate the thought about the world building, and from a video game perspective, you know, we talk about open worlds and the platforms, and, you know, you try to get into mobile platforms and gaming, and this world building is always a part of that. If you think about The Sims, if you think about Minecraft and my son and Roblox and the requests I get for that. But as we build out this conversation here, thanks. For a moment, I was like, oh, should I move? As we build this conversation here today, and we think about the impact and why it matters, who makes technology and who controls the wealth, which is the real arc of this conversation, and we start to anchor this. Tanya, I want to start with you. You talked about in your remarks about other voices, Afrofuturism voices, and you had to start a list. And what shapes our understanding as what is possible. You talked about your journey as a person, going to college and being exposed, and then how that continued and working with your students, and then to your children that you have, the twins, my apologies. As we think about that, can you speak more broadly about the thoughts you have about the role that Afrofuturism has played in freeing our imagination, or can continue, regardless of what culture or ethnicity you come from?
Sure, yes. So I'm going to answer that. I'm going to circle back a little bit to what I was talking about earlier this morning, because what I realized was that as you were having the conversation about origin stories, is what I realized is that I was giving you my origin story as an Afrofuturist educator, right? And it reminded me that, you know, when we have our superpowers, when we have our superhero alter ego, that there's always a starting point, right? There's always an origin. Like there's always a narrative around how you came into being, how you came to realize your powers and your abilities, and how you're going to use them. So telling that story today was my way of also mirroring what we do in the classroom. And I think it's interesting that you start with world building, because one of our first units is called world building, where we determine what our lens is going to be, where we define our terms, and where we figure out what our superpowers are as we kind of work our way through the literature that we're also reading as the models for this. And so I think it's important for Afrofuturism to be able to help the students to locate their latent abilities. And, and we start off talking about flight, right? And the power and the superhero power of flight. And we read this very short story called The Voyeur by Rand Walker, who is a Morehouse alum. And I like to start there because, again, it's like full circle for them to kind of be in this class, in this space, and then reading people who were also in that space and how they are now using what they learned at the institution for their in their career and in their life. And so we start with this story about flight. And it is about a young boy who is trying to bring out his superhero ability to fly. But unfortunately, it doesn't work. He falls to the ground and he dies, right? But the question is, what is flight? Like, because for a minute, he's suspended in air and his cape is floating and it looks like he is going to actually move through the air. And we circle back and we think about Milkman Dead in Song of Solomon and how he was obsessed with flight. And at the end, when you surrender to the air, you can fly, right? And there's a question there. Does he fly, right? His great-grandfather did. Or does he fall to his death? But the point is to not answer, the literal, does he die, does he fly? But it's to hone in on the idea that it is possible, right? And that through stories like the Flying Africans, right, that there is a narrative that says we took our own control over our bodies, over our narratives, our stories, and our future, and we said no. We put down, the cotton and the bales, and with the word of the elder, we flew away, flew back to Africa. Right? And so when we think about how we can tap into our real life capabilities, flight is a metaphor, right, for bigger things. And so that's what I try to have my students kind of understand, is that while we're talking about superpowers, right, because we can't see through walls and we're not bulletproof, and we see that in real life, how not being bulletproof kills us, right? But if we can envision ourselves as another way to kind of deflect the harm and deflect the violence, then we can see ourselves arriving as a full-bodied human being, right, in the future. And so, to me, that's what Afrofuturism provides, right? It gives us a way to talk about abilities that I see are in us, but are not necessarily nurtured and pulled out of us. And Afrofuturism helps pull it out of them. It says, hey, maybe I can fly. Or if I can't literally take flight, and what else does flight mean for me? Historically, it's meant something, right? And the other ability is breathing underwater and what water means, and the idea that people who jumped over rather than go into enslavement, that they lived and they thrived, under the sea, and they evolved into something else, right? And so, yeah, so I'm sorry, that's what,
No, that's
so
good.
that's
No,
what,
you're good.
so that's what I use it for as a tool, right? This idea of possibilities by tapping into and realizing who you really are, right? And who you were meant to be because of who you have been, right? Ancestrally speaking. Yeah.
That's really powerful. Thank you, Tanya. And to build on that, the imagination and what is possible, Walter, with your work with Wakanda and how technology is woven in to the point that it's commonplace, right? You know, there used to be a time, you know, if you had a smartphone or a page or anything, you were the exception, right? And today it's ubiquitous and it's the norm. You know, when you were creating that and you were thinking about the daily lives of people and the impact versus what we see as that extraction economy and always pulling out, and you juxtaposition that with what was co-powered and created by you and your team, well, you want to share what was the motivation behind that, you know, the role that it continuously played in their lives?
So that's really deep for me. I'm going to try and do it kind of quick, but this piece where the co-powering virtue and the way that we do that as a practice is absolutely fundamental to who I am. The first nonprofit I founded was called the Ujima Collective. And so Ujima is the Swahili word for collective work and responsibility. And we were built around everybody puts in a little and we get a whole lot back out of what we put in. And so I would say the first project I ever did before I was even out of middle school was a community food project, very similar to what goes on at the Hallie Q. Brown Center right now, just a couple blocks from here, about making sure people have the food that they need every week so that they don't have to struggle and face hunger, let alone starvation in some of the cases, some of our senior households. And so I can't imagine a world where I'm not involved in community this way and doing the things that need to be done minute by minute, hour by hour. And that principle continued to evolve for me, where my dissertation was based on the fact that both of my parents nearly died in a car accident and I needed to go back home and care for them. And when I went back and started to look around for what I could study, the place where I had grown up was being wiped off of the map systematically by new residential development. Not as suddenly as what happened with Rondo. It took about 20 years to basically wipe out the black community that I came from. But I was determined to use my research opportunity to preserve whatever I could of those histories as I saw the way my entire state was changing. And as a result, I thought I'd spend most of my career talking about the destruction of black community, because most of the time people would talk about either Harlem or Chicago or Atlanta, Los Angeles, places that are much harder to just entirely wipe out, but they would still evolve in particular ways. But small black towns were uniquely vulnerable. And so I started to say, you know, I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the places that are gone. And what I ended up discovering about a decade in was that there were tools, like studying transportation, like studying urban planning, that we could stop the way black places and communities were being destroyed. And this happened almost simultaneously with Wakanda, Black Panther, and then Wakanda Forever coming out. And so now most of the work that I do when I'm not teaching class is preserving and expanding black communities that are in danger. And I have over 2,000 clients just in the US. And so that work is miraculous to me in a very visceral way, when I can wake up and find new tools and new ways and new strategies to preserve and expand and celebrate black community. So all of that, for me, it's not just the value of how do we do these things together. It's challenging the overarching assumption that we have to be competitive, that we have to build certain kinds of industry that are just extractive. I believe in using tools of biomimicry, using different kinds of organic architecture, things that let us be in harmony with nature in very practical ways, that these are not kind of high-minded abstractions about what might be possible 100 years from now. Like, we can do these things right now. Something as simple as geothermal heating, which we're actually installing here on this campus. Can you imagine if we adopt that as a standard practice across the region or across the upper Midwest? Like there are a variety of really exciting possibilities about what we can do with the knowledge and technologies we have to change the kind of life that we live, especially if we ground ourselves in questions of relationship to indigenous sovereignty and indigenous nationhood and kind of land back movements. The way that we then forge coalition between people of African descent and indigenous communities and use that as a starting point for all the people who now inhabit the places where we live. So those things are very real to me, and the way I try and move forward, because it's hard. Like, there are a lot of bad assumptions we make about having to inherit the way business has been done for 20, 50, 100 years. And pushing back against industrialization, period, against commercial capitalism that now has about 2 centuries of momentum behind it. You know, people assume that those things are inevitable, and they're not. and we can do really amazing things when we break out of those shells. So there's one side of it for me that's academic about the work and crossing disciplines and not accepting the boundaries of I can't talk to economists, I can't talk to the statisticians or the physics scholars. Like, I don't accept really any of that. I try to cross boundaries and bring people together. But even beyond that, I think the Academy needs to be in dialogue with public policy, with community leadership, in a way that's much healthier for all of us. And again, I think there's a real potential here in St. Paul where it's not the same. Say if I go into Alabama, so I work with people down at Tuskegee. And Tuskegee is Wakanda. Like, folks don't appreciate how powerful it was to have an institute to like advance technical training in the 1880s and 1890s. That place, the state of Alabama will never take on sustained equitable investment in Tuskegee. And it's insane because it cripples the state's economy. Like, they're actually doing damage to themselves by not investing in the Tuskegee Institute, in Tuskegee University. And so those kinds of decisions, they're embedded in the way that society is segregated. They're embedded in the kind of bad habits we've inherited over time. And just getting people to think carefully about rejecting bad habits and restoring a place like Rondo as a neighborhood. Maybe the most valuable piece I'm doing right now is in South Minneapolis with the George Floyd Global Memorial, is that I came to them and they have all these artifacts that we're celebrating and given to honor the life of George Floyd and to demonstrate solidarity against the reckless killing of Black people around the world. And they were just trying to find a way to digitize what was donated and just create images and records so that people could see them online on a website. Man, Bryson is here, is working on that project. And so I was like, well, why aren't we building a memorial? Why aren't we trying to pitch a museum that actually is dedicated to anti-racism? Like, how do we think bigger about what we can accomplish in the next 10 years? And so there are those kinds of things that I am not a normal kind of just sit in the library historian. Like, I want to get out and reshape the world that I live in and give those tools. Oh, that was what I wanted to say. If you all have Instagram, you can actually do this in this session. Just search on your Instagram for an image related to, I would say, Wakanda. Yeah, since we're in a Wakanda session. Just look at what people have created in their minds to share on a social media platform about what Wakanda is and what it means. Screen cap that, post it for yourself, and then tag 2 of the friends that are on your list to do something similar. Challenge them. We do have these little challenges where people dump water on their heads, have a lot of fun with the activities. But we can do game-like challenges to drive this conversation in a really organic way where people can continue to create, innovate, and explore what's possible. And tag me. I'm on there, Walter D. Grayson. Tag me. I promise you. I'll get another couple hundred people joining that thing in the next 24 hours. But we play these games.
Challenge given.
Go back to tap. Challenge. but we do these things where we are pushing each other to create and discover and explore together, and it leads to all manner of unexpected positive outcomes.
I appreciate that. The challenge has been given, so we'll you can wait till afterwards to pull the phones out. Gabe. But thank you for sharing. And you built on something about communities. And Marika, with the work that you've been doing and partnering, how do you identify partners and truly enabling those relationships to embark on the journey of the co-powering of the emergent horizon? How do you think about the organizations, think about the ways of working? What are you looking for? How do you identify that?
So that is a really simple question to answer, and that is recognizing that I am not an expert of everything. I go into spaces with curiosity and listen. And so I believe that Wakanda was built out of listening to people and what they would have liked to have seen, what would have been possible. So going into communities, it also helps to be from the community or identify as the community, but a part of that work has been showing up for each other, seeing the connections of the dots across the work, whether it is environmental, whether it is technological, whether it is artistic and theatrical. And so a part of going into communities is making sure that you're hearing who they say they are, and then how that resonates with your own spirit and making that connection across those boundaries. And time. Time is a premium, and time is what it takes to build trust, to actually get to the questions, to even know what I need to be curious about, because I have my preconceived notions about what the community needs, what they've done, who's running the show. And so just time to be present in space, to unpack what I'm bringing into that space before I can actually have enough room to carry what I'm becoming a part of, or we are becoming a part of. And being very transparent that I have an agenda, obviously, but how do our agendas align and how do they connect? And so also asking permission to be a part of the community with folks that are holding the pillars up, and bringing the talents that I have to bear, whether it is showing up to be behind a volunteer table, or where do you need me? I don't need to come in with the hat that I carry when I'm out at TCIA. We'll get to that. And that may take 3 to 5 years, because I think about you talking about Michelle Chevin with the Ford Foundation. We met and were in conversation for 3 years before we could figure out our alignment. Or I think about the conversation we had in Ramsey County about what is this that needs to be unpacked, and not really understanding, like, when we're unpacking these things, that also unravels people's lives. And so not just thinking about the front end, but when we make a decision to move and act as a community, what do we have in place for the consequences that come for speaking our truth? And so we can't be really short-sighted when we come into community, because if we do the same thing that we've been doing in communities, I might be a part of that community, but I'm still bringing that pain to bear, and that is a responsibility that I have to carry, and the transparency. And acknowledging the harm that has existed, but naming the potential that we have to work together, because I'm willing to learn along the way. I'm willing to fail and make mistakes and be humble enough to hear the feedback. Like, I totally misread that. And so the authenticity that is required to be in a co-powering place is really about decentering and being able to read, reread, and remember, because I might have to hear it 17 times before it actually tracks with me. And so, again, it's a practice. It's not a, I'm going to jump in and jump out and do it. This is a lifelong practice.
That's good. I appreciate you sharing. And to build on that, one, the repetitive nature of the work, two, asking permission to come in, three, stating that you have an agenda, or at least a perceived aim or direction that you may come in with. And then going back to that repetitive part, I think when we think about the work that you all are doing is anchored, as it was mentioned, historically, right? And honoring the history, yet grappling with the realities and the contextual nature of the present, and then leaning with momentum, right? That momentum to have this dynamic future. When I'm looking at you right now, Tanya, as we think about the literature and the work that you've done and expanding that universe for people, I know some of your work with the artifacts, if we think about, creating that space and interacting with that as we talk about Wakanda, right? And you think about some of the imagery that was created and some of the visualization. You also are doing work with education in a very virtual space. And making those connections. What has that been like from your direction, and why did you embark on that as a way of engaging your students to see what was possible?
Thank you for that. It's not very often that I get to talk about Morehouse in the metaverse, which is what the program is called, but our former provost received a grant to bring virtual reality to Morehouse's campus and to bring it into the classroom in real pedagogically important ways. And he put the call out for faculty who were interested, and the timing was such that I had just come off of a workshop about the possibilities of digital humanities. And so I was thinking kind of in a technological digital space at the time, and then thought that this could be a good extension of what I had just learned. And so there were four original faculty members who were brought into the program and the grant. It was myself, two representatives from the humanities. We had a historian, we had a chemist, and we had a biologist. So the four of us, we built the Morehouse in the Metaverse program from the ground up, right? We had to do the training. So we had to learn the technology. I had to learn to get used to being in virtual reality. It's very disconcerting and disorienting at first. And then we got to also design our classroom spaces and talk about, with the designers, we partnered with a group called Engage. It's an education tech company, and they built out the rooms. We had to learn how to manipulate objects, and so I went, and I was already teaching the Blacks in Wonderlands course, science fiction and fantasy, and so it seemed like a natural fit, right? Being able to teach science fiction in virtual reality, I was like, oh, that's a no-brainer. But actually, it was harder than I thought, right? Because how do you teach literature in a space that is technical? I had to kind of bridge that gap for myself. But the first thing I did was create a class. Let me back up a bit. So our curriculum for Gen Ed is based on culturally relevant pedagogy, right? So we have to cover things that are related to Black life history and culture when our classes have this certain designation. And so I was thinking about how do you make that bridge between some very new technology and what I was teaching, science fiction. And so what I came up with was different modules that kind of introduce different aspects of literature. And I started with mirroring my own classroom in virtual reality, like a literary salon. In in the model of the literary salons that you would see in Harlem, New York during the Harlem Renaissance. So we brought in kind of ways in which to ground students in virtual spaces that reflected important historical locations, right, that are related to Black life, history, and culture. We got to decorate the room with, things from Morehouse, things that were personal to us. For example, we all fitted out our rooms in all of our Greek paraphernalia and things like, I'm a Delta. And we, so we really kind of made it our own. So it wasn't just about the material that we were teaching, but it was also very much about the space that we were creating so that when we brought them in, they felt like it was relevant to who they were. The other thing that Engage did was build a digital twin campus of Morehouse. So when we land in virtual reality, we are landing in the middle of Morehouse's campus. And so we have our famous buildings, the statue of Dr. Mays, and it was really powerful because when we first started, it was during COVID, and I was teaching freshmen who had never been to campus. And so having them put the headset on from wherever they were in the world, because we have international students too, and they got the headsets shipped to them at no cost. It was all covered by the grant. And having them put on those headsets and us all being at Morehouse and talking about the historical relevance of that space and then being able to experience it in real time and as real as it could be during COVID was really impactful for them. And we brought in another unit that I'm particularly proud of is how I taught Kindred by Octavia Butler. And it started with, I wanted to take students through a journey because that whole thing about being pulled back into slavery and what that would feel like and what would you do if one day you just started transporting back in time and then you realized that you had to save your white ancestor so that you could be alive in the future. And I wanted to capture that uncomfortableness that Dana experiences. And so we walked through what it means to kind of not be in charge of one's own body. And so the people at Engage built a slave ship modeled after Amistad. And the students could walk and be a part and be on this slave ship and see the enslaved Africans in the belly of the ship and chained. And it's something that you have to be kind of very mindful of their well-being in this space, right? Because for the first time, they're being immersed in things that they had only read about in textual books, right? And so we really delved into how this could make you feel, but digging into why it was important as we read this book about Dana being pulled into a time period that she had only read about, right? And so that level of uncomfortability and them sitting in that for a moment. And also I should say that students were able to opt out and I gave them alternative assignment, but no one did. They were all open to the experience.
So you led with the fact that this may be traumatic? Oh, because you had already walked through it before.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. There's a whole orientation section that's involved with getting them prepared to be in virtual reality. And then I did the extra prep for that particular unit because I knew that it could be triggering for some of our students. And so I would have, these check-ins after class, and we had exit, you can take surveys and all this in the headset, and I had exit polls so that they could talk about how they felt and what they saw and how they interacted with the beings that were on the ships, with the ghosts that were on the ship. So that was, I think, one of the most innovative ways that I have approached teaching slave narratives, because I will say that I view Kindred as a neo-slave narrative, a new era slave narrative.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that, because that is talking about how you, one, anchor the past, right-size that, create the empathy and the connection, and then contextualize in the virtual world, much like the world building aspect, in order to create the place and that connection, and then to inspire what is the future. So I really appreciate you sharing that. As we, I think we have about maybe 30 minutes left as we start to move forward. Walter, with your work and kind of building on that narrative and the lessons learned, you know, Wakanda was woven over time and creating a world and environment, world building that was both digital, had human beings actually interacting with it real time. What are the lessons learned, much historically, right? If you could transport that to that emergent horizon that you would want the audience to know, like, these are the things I would like to see. These are the lessons learned of what's possible, and that as we co-power what is yet to arrive. Your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. So thank you, and I love what you've done. Like, that is just so important. And you know, we talk all the time, but like to see the way the work has evolved and comes together, I definitely have some links to share. But so it makes me to go back to 2015, which was right after Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, outside of St. Louis. And, you know, this was a big deal for Black Lives Matter, where, you know, the nation was trying to figure out how to articulate, you know, what was happening in terms of the violence of law enforcement in Black communities. And the Afrofuturist community, which had not gotten this kind of national or global acknowledgement at that point, got together at Princeton University with Ruha Benjamin hosting. And Ruha Benjamin, for folks don't know, is foremost scholar on kind of race and technology, and just has a new book out called Viral Justice that's definitely worth y'all taking a look at. Teaching her content, an earlier book on race and technology this coming spring in my racism and digital tech class. So if y'all here at McAllister and want to drop in, come stop through. But that work, when we got together for Ferguson is the Future. You know you're going to come through whenever you want. Come on now. But yeah, Ferguson is Future was amazing because we had all these sci-fi writers. The big get for me was Tananarive Due, who is just legendary Black horror writer, and Stephen Barnes, her husband, were there. And yeah, to sit in conversation with the Black science fiction and fantasy writers and actually have all the Black activists there, and then a bunch of us who were doing the scholarly side of Afrofuturism, just amazing few days. But the core theme of our conversation was about our superpowers. Like our opening chat was, you know, what's your superpower? And so the ones that stood out frequently, people were talking about, they were shapeshifters, that depending on the circumstance, who they were and how they dressed and what color their hair was and just how they manifested changed according to the day and the circumstance and the kinds of purpose that they needed to fulfill. Then a couple of us academics, of course, historians, were like, we're time travelers. We're always moving through time. And how do we get to experience exactly what you're talking about with Kindred, that it's 1 minute you're in, you know, the 1970s Los Angeles, the next time you're in 1830s Maryland, and it's just a completely different way of knowing yourself. Given that, and given the way I wrote the Wakanda syllabus in 2016, coming out of that experience, I really wanted to involve students in that conversation. And so just as the Black Panther movie came out in February of 18, I was teaching essentially a history of racism and science fiction class. And the final project of the class, the students had to design a map. And my students in my freshman class, Mihala, what's up? had to do this project of figuring out how do you create a particular place and then negotiate your experience through it. And then the best 3 of the maps that the students created became the basis of a digital online game called Sojourner's Trail. And so Sojourner's Trail is about experiencing historically thriving African American communities, because we typically assume that Black communities are impoverished, struggling, not being able to kind of protect themselves. And so I think we did 3 layers of the game to start with, and it first got published in 2019. Now it is 13 layers, and it's not like a 2-dimensional game anymore. For New Orleans and for coastal New Jersey, and I'm trying to think, there's one more. I think it might be Pittsburgh. We have 3-dimensional environments for people to enter into the space and learn the history of these Black communities and why they were so prosperous at different points in time. So for me, that works in a lot of ways to trouble and subvert like the narratives about Black places, that they're always kind of on the margins, and just destroys that. But like, lets us understand that there are places where there is prosperity. There are ways to put us back in a time that's not about trauma, that is about how do we enjoy and celebrate the experiences that we have in these places and times. So I'm working with a bunch of VR scientists at North Carolina State and at the University of Arizona. We're going to build out all the other 3D levels. If you go to my website, walterdgrayson.com, you can see the direct links. The one we just did was for the Irish national government. And so we did a virtual Dublin about the struggle to overthrow English oppression. And so that's a big part of my next levels of work, is how do we tell the stories of the history through these VR and AR environments that actually empower people to make better worlds today. That it's, I see the way people love Fortnite and Minecraft and the various kind of massively multiplayer online games, but we can use that same technology to explore some really deep and important fundamental human questions that are both aesthetic and creative and also technical and extraordinarily scientific. And I think fusing those skill sets in this way, it actually led to the displays that you all have over on the side of the room about Beyond Black Panther. The next stage of what we're doing there, this came from Michigan State, and I would love to work with anybody here in kind of updating what they have there, because that was just a brief snapshot of what came out of the Wakanda syllabus, but there's so much more that's available now.
Thank you. Really appreciate that sharing of those lessons and actually contextualizing that to say what is actually happening real time and the work that's being done, and how technology, even presently from a historical context and education and building empathy and co-powering there, to actually spreading that, actually the notion of that, and building out games, working with students and actually showing what aspirations actually existed, and then being able to walk through that, and then actually exporting that out to Ireland and being able to actually get them invested, and then building that forward in order to engage. As we arc the conversation, I think we have maybe about 15 minutes left, so we're going to open this up to some Q&A after we spill the water. We can align. I want to align on the work that you're doing and how, Marieke, how this can be pulled together when you think about that co-powering that we talked about, that emergent horizon. And this is work that has been new and that is emerging out of the realities that are present and past, and then leaning towards with momentum towards that future. What do you see as the opportunity here in this space? For the public good, of course.
So as I'm thinking about the world going forward and grounding it in our data for public good and thinking about points of entry, I think it really is about shaping our way of inviting people into these new spaces and creating these new spaces collectively. I think it's also important for us to think about, okay, so if we're thinking about an emergent horizon, so I'm thinking about this trip I took. I was driving from Las Vegas to the Grand Canyon. And I was on this road, and there was this absolutely gorgeous sunset, I think, as I was driving. And I kept getting closer to it and closer to it. And while the sunset, it didn't appear to be changing, it was always on the cusp, always on the cusp. And so when I think about co-powering and having the opportunity to work in community collectively, I think it really is very simple, is again, creating these spaces, the safe and brave spaces for us to practice. I like even thinking about gaming as a way to innovate in this space is like, what can we create out of this gaming process? What can we create out of the virtual reality in our classrooms? I think it's really positing and putting people into new scenarios where they get to kind of look around, be disoriented, and yet grounding themselves in, okay, we have these collective values, we're in this space, what is it that we see as possible based on just what the foundation has been built? And one of the biggest pieces, and I think it's really interesting of how you said how vulnerable you had to be and your students had to be in that virtual reality. And so it's not like this significant technological move. It is really just being in space with each other with the humility and empathy.